the responsibility of this is for the OTAN, or for the NATO, for the Russia, for the United States. Who is responsible for this?
It's important to understand that in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet state system and the withdrawal of Soviet forces back to the Soviet Union, a promise was made, both in writing as well as verbally, to Mr. Gorbachev, who at the time was president of the Soviet Union, eventually to become Russia, that we would not advance the border of NATO to the edge of the Soviet or future Russian state. In other words, we would not take advantage of the Soviet Union's weakness by replacing Soviet forces in the various countries in Eastern Europe, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, with US and NATO forces. So the real problem from the very beginning was with this promise and our subsequent decisions through a series of administrations, beginning with President Clinton, to begin incorporating former Warsaw Pact states into the new expanding NATO alliance. This culminated in 2007, 2008 in Budapest at the conference when Mr. Putin, as the new president, made it very clear that any attempt to push U.S. and NATO or allied forces to the border with Russia was unacceptable and would provoke a conflict, potentially. And he's very straightforward about this. Everyone who heard him in 2007 and 2008 understood exactly what he was discussing and exactly what he meant. Nevertheless, people in Washington decided that his views were irrelevant, that Russia was too weak to stop us, and as a result, we could press this matter all the way to Russia's border with the goal at some point, I suspect, though it was never stated at the time, though we've heard this since then, to democratize Russia on the Western model. In other words, make Russia a replicant, or what's the right word, a replica of Western liberal states. This, of course, made a collision inevitable. Now, the collision itself comes about because in 2014, after we successfully installed a government in Kiev that was unambiguously tied to Washington and NATO, we began this process of building a very large and powerful Ukrainian army and supporting armed forces in eastern Ukraine. Finally, we also allowed the Ukrainians to continue their war against the Russian-speaking provinces in eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, to the point where some 14,000 people were killed over the last 8 years, the subsequent 8 years, trying to survive constant shelling and attacks by the Ukrainian government. Mr. Putin then met with the leaders of the West in the context of the so-called Minsk Accords in a last-ditch effort to try and rescue the situation by compelling Ukraine to treat all of its citizens equally before the law, by making it specifically clear in law that Russians living in Ukraine who were Ukrainian citizens would be treated exactly the same way as Ukrainian citizens living in Ukraine, that they would be represented and they would have full and equal rights, that they would be allowed to speak their language, educate their children in that language, and so forth, while at the same time recognizing Kiev's sovereignty and legitimacy. As we now know, that turned out to be a farce, because Mrs. Merkel, the former Chancellor of Germany, has admitted publicly that the entire exercise was simply designed to buy Ukraine more time to build up this enormous army. And finally, Mr. Putin made it clear that in addition to this army that was emerging in eastern Ukraine, what he feared was the sudden emplacement of missiles, theater ballistic missiles or intercontinental, but probably theater ballistic missiles that could target and destroy Russia's nuclear deterrent, which of course was unacceptable, as well as put Russia's major cities and population centers into a target array that could result in the destruction of Russia. Finally, another effort was made in December of 2021, and again in January of 2022, to come to some sort of reasonable understanding of what the minimal requirements were for Russian security. These were rejected out of hand, and instead, he was told that until the Russians withdrew from Crimea, which we continue to insist erroneously was a part of Ukraine, when historically Crimea was never part of Ukraine. Crimea ended up inside a Ukrainian border that was drawn by Khrushchev and his drunken friends in the Communist Party in the 1950s. That unless they withdrew from Crimea and the so-called breakaway provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk rejoined Ukraine, recognizing Ukrainian dominance and sovereignty, that we would not do anything to support Mr. Putin and his plea for some sort of reconciliation or understanding with the West. This provoked the Russians, and they began this process on the 24th of February to try and convince the West that it should negotiate an end to the conflict. That, of course, failed miserably and has brought us to the current set of circumstances, which places us on the edge of essentially all-out war with Russia.
Following this topic, continuing, I'd like to know your opinion about the current role made by the United States in the context of this crisis in Ukraine, and how do you evaluate this role could develop in the coming years with a possible return to power of the Republican Party?
Well, first I should say that I am not sure that a Republican victory at this point would make a great deal of difference. The Republican Party and the Democratic Party, certainly on matters of foreign and defense policy, are largely identical in their outlook and views. We don't have time to go into the explanation for that, but I think it's a long-term development, and it is why inside the United States you hear many people talk about the criticality of building a third party, a new party that would consist of people on the Republican side and Democrats who are truly nationalists and conservatives. It will be interesting to see if that happens. That takes a great deal of time, money, and resources, but I just don't think we can expect much change from the existing two-party structure. Now, having said that, I think we are in a very difficult position right now with Russia, because the Russians have switched their attitude from one of fight and negotiate to one of preparing potentially for all-out war with the West. They now recognize that they are at war not simply with Washington, but its vassal states in Europe. I say vassal deliberately because you have a group of elites in the western part of Europe and in Washington who are very much the same, many of whom have gone to the same schools, share the same attitudes and values, and they are committed to this confrontation with Russia. I do not think it is sustainable for all sorts of reasons. We have severe economic problems inside the United States as well as in the West. I think we can argue globally we have financial and economic difficulties right now. I also think that inside the United States, our social cohesion, I don't know how you translate that, but it's a very important concept, is at an all-time low. There are people inside the United States who are not simply foreigners. They may, in fact, be American citizens, but seem to have adopted a position of hatred and antipathy towards the United States, its government, its constitution, its way of life. So we have severe problems at home. For these kinds of reasons, I don't think this confrontation will last indefinitely. We simply have too much trouble and too much work to do at home to maintain this hostile posture overseas against Russia, or for that matter, China. But in the meantime, the Russians are determined to put an end to the Ukrainian threat to their country. Whatever emerges at the end of this process, Ukraine will not be a member of NATO. I am quite frankly increasingly convinced that NATO itself may not survive, because just as much of the American population feels alienated from its government, large numbers of Europeans, particularly in France, Germany, and Great Britain, are feeling alienated from their governments. So I expect to see turnover in the leadership of European states that will also object to this permanent state of conflict with Russia. There are very few people today who know anything about Russia who believe that Russia is interested in conquering Eastern Europe. That is simply nonsensical. What they want to do is do business. Russia is different from the West, but it doesn't mean that Russia is evil. And I think more and more Europeans are coming around to that understanding.
What is the condition on the battlefield today? Is it possible to point who is more successful? What is the reality of the operation at this time? Or, in other words, who's winning?
Today, there are roughly 700,000 Russian troops on the periphery of Ukraine or in southern Ukraine. They're organized into 3 giant concentrations, one in the south, somewhere is between 180 and 220,000 troops, another concentration further to the east near Belgrade, over 100 to 150,000 troops, a similar concentration in Belarusia to the north. These 3 concentrations are prepared now to resume a major offensive against Ukraine. Precisely when that will happen, how it will happen, we obviously don't know. But these are extremely well-armed, well-trained troops. They include the 300,000 reservists that were mobilized. In addition to that, there are 80,000 volunteers that have shown up to fight. And we see a lot of evidence that mobilization is quietly being continued in Russia, which suggests to us that the Russians are prepared in the event that we should try to intervene in this war to fight a larger war. The Russians have not taken heavy casualties by the standards of the day, and that's not surprising because their systems that do most of the damage, artillery, rocket, missile systems, have inflicted 75% of the damage on Ukrainian forces. For every one, well, let's put it this way, every day the Ukrainians are capable of firing perhaps 600 to 6,500 rounds a day. In other words, 6,500 rounds maximum. Every day, Russian forces can fire 60,000 rounds a day, which means that if you are within range of Russian forces, your ability to move, your ability to survive, particularly if you are static and dug in, is about nil, nothing. And as a result, the Ukrainians have lost at least 150 to 160,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers. They've taken at least 400,000 casualties. There are reports that there may have been as many as over 200,000 Ukrainian troops killed at this point. The Ukrainians have been through 12 mobilizations. Their manpower resources are almost exhausted. They are forcing what is left into uniform to fight at the quote-unquote front in southern Ukraine. Ukrainians are doing everything they can to avoid this since they regard being sent to the front as a death sentence. The numbers of Ukrainians left inside Ukraine under Zelensky's control are somewhere between 18 and 22 million. This is from an original population of 37.5 million at the beginning of the war. Over 10 million Ukrainians have left the country. 2 million Ukrainians were already working in the European Union and the United Kingdom. 4 million Ukrainians who are really Russians and speak Russians are living happily under Russian administration now in southern and eastern Ukraine. Then when you look at the casualties, you discover suddenly that the population size in Ukraine today that is not under occupation is roughly the same size as the Netherlands, or 22 million at the most, more likely 18 or 19 million. The 10 million people that have left Ukraine, whenever they have been interviewed in the West, all say with absolute conviction they will not return. I would argue that the Ukrainian state, perhaps the Ukrainian nation, has been effectively destroyed in this war. Why the Russians have not already launched these remaining offensives with the hundreds of thousands of troops at their disposal is unknown to me. I think it could happen at any moment. The temperatures are now dropping very, very greatly in Ukraine, so the ground is freezing. There's no problem with trafficability. Obviously, the longer this war lasts, the more likely Ukraine is to die as a nation. And that is probably the most disturbing thing for me, that people in the West don't seem to care.
What do you believe to be necessary for an effective solution to resolve the crisis in Ukraine? What model of world do you understand that would enable a peaceful coexistence between the United States and Russia in a situation of geopolitical balance? Is the United States ready for a multipolar order now?
Well, those are two important questions. The second one is probably the most important. Is the United States ready to live in a so-called multipolar world? Well, to be frank, it doesn't make any difference whether the United States is ready for it. It already lives in a multipolar world, which is a normal condition of the planet. And in a multipolar world, great powers normally pursue policies that are designed to avoid dangerous conflict. If you go back over the last 50 or 60 years of American history, almost every president that encountered a crisis involving the Soviet Union or China worked very hard to avoid war, to come up with some sort of solution. Before World War II, and certainly before World War I, most of the great powers in Europe tried to avoid a devastating war. They recognized that there would be limited conflicts, but they worked hard to bring them rapidly to a close. That, of course, was because of the experience with Napoleon Bonaparte, which caused the deaths of millions and destroyed Europe. I think we need to live in that kind of world again, where there's a recognition that there will be disputes, but these disputes should be settled amicably if they can. And if there is any fighting, it has to be limited and of short duration, because it is not in anyone's interest to destroy our civilization. Not sure we are there yet. We still have lots of people who are convinced that we remain the sole superpower, which is nonsense. There are several great powers of which we are one. We may be stronger than most, but in many areas we are not. But this is a longer term issue, and I don't think it's a problem for the American people. And this is something that your population needs to understand, the people you are talking to. Most Americans on any given day are completely disinterested in what happens outside the borders of their country, because frankly, most of what happens in the world does not affect them. We're a very large country. We're much more concerned with what we are doing to ourselves right now than anything we are doing overseas. So the multipolar world question is a good one. It's too soon to say, but eventually we're going to have to live with that, whether we like it or not. Now, can you go back and explain the first question? You asked a question before the multipolar one. I took the second one first. What was the first?
About the solutions for the Ukraine crisis. What do you believe to be necessary for an effective solution now in this model of the world of the multipolarity?
No one in Washington right now wants to admit that they made a mistake. They miscalculated. They thought that Russia was weak, that Russia could be isolated and bullied. They were dead wrong. Russia cannot be isolated. It is resource rich. It is surrounded by states and nations that are happy to do business with it. In fact, Europe will eventually do business with Russia again as well. So that was nonsensical. Secondly, they misunderstood the initial phase of the operation. Putin went in with a small force that was designed to create the conditions for negotiations. He was not interested in destroying Ukraine and killing large numbers of Orthodox Christian Ukrainians or Orthodox Christian Russians. He miscalculated, and he conveyed an impression to the West that Russia was militarily weak. It isn't. And that's what we're seeing right now. It is very powerful. And now Russia is going to return, I think, for the foreseeable future to a position of great military power in Europe and Asia that it once occupied in the past, because it sees no alternative to that to protect itself against us. Now, how do we get past all of this and try to put an end to this destructive war? Number one, Washington should step forward, preferably the president, and say, we want to have negotiations, talks, discussions with the Russians without preconditions. No preconditions. In other words, drop all the nonsense about Russia must be humiliated, Russia must withdraw, Russia must do any of these things. That's unrealistic nonsense. It's an excuse for no solution. That needs to stop. If these talks go forward at some point, then we can talk about a potential ceasefire. But those two things must happen first. One, peace negotiations without preconditions, and eventually a ceasefire. But if you're sitting in Russia's position right now, having been lied to by us repeatedly about a whole range of things, why would you agree to a ceasefire? Russia is dominating the battlefield. It is poised to destroy what remains of the Ukrainian armed forces. It's not going to agree to a ceasefire. So the best that you can hope for right now are talks without preconditions. And when I say without preconditions, I mean without preconditions. There will have to be arrangements, adjustments to borders. And this is not the first time in the history of Europe that great powers have settled wars by adjusting borders, particularly in Ukraine, where the borders have shifted dozens and dozens of times over the last several hundred years. This is how peace is made. So clinging to this nonsensical idea that this Soviet-era construct drawn by Lenin and subsequently expanded by Khrushchev has any meaning needs to be dropped.
Could you please say some words, send a final message to our Brazilian listeners?
The key to peace right now in Eastern Europe and probably throughout most of the world is for Washington to recognize the legitimate security interests of its partners. Russia has legitimate security interests in Ukraine. Remember that for most of its history, certainly over the last 400 years, Ukraine was part of Russia. Prior to that, it was part of Polish Lithuania and occasionally part of Sweden and Austria-Hungary. The point is that Ukraine has not in its history ever been fully sovereign and independent. That should have been recognized early on. So for the future, we need to recognize the legitimate interests of all nations and not simply try to dictate to others what their interests are or to impose our interests on others. There's no real requirement to do so. It's not important to us. The most important thing is for us to trade with everyone. And that should be our top priority, and intervention militarily should be the last thing that we think about. In the meantime, I wish you all the best. God bless all of you for what you're doing, and God bless your countrymen. Thank you.